Hi. So in this video, I'm going to go over a handful or a few LSAT questions. We're going to look at some logical reasoning questions, so arguments, and yeah, shout out to RP for commenting and requesting this video. I'm sure it'll be helpful to others as well. Okay, great. So the first question I'm going to look at is question 26 from the 90 plus prep test, section 4. All right, so the question stem, which I do look at first just to get an idea of whether I'm dealing with an argument in the stimulus or a series of statements. Here we have flawed reasoning. So we definitely have an argument. We're looking at a parallel flaw type. So we want to look at the structure certainly, but we are going to be focused on the flaw and then trying to match that to one of the answer choices. All right, so in order to find the flaw, we first want to identify the conclusion. Okay, so ID the conclusion. The second step would be to identify the support that's offered for that conclusion. And then the third step would be to identify the flaw, which is why is the support insufficient, not enough, to prove the conclusion. Okay. And we may be able to do that in like an abstract way, or we might want to talk about something that the argument or the advocate fails to consider, right? Something they ignore that they shouldn't be ignoring, or something that they take for granted, which would be something that they assume is true that might not actually be true. Okay. And what they fail to consider or take for granted, these are things that definitely are going to have to be, relevant to the issue at hand. Alrighty, so if we've got those steps, let's go through them. So our argument says every Labrador Retriever in my neighborhood is a well-behaved dog. However, no pet would be well-behaved if it were not trained. Thus, it is training, not the genetic makeup of the breed, that accounts for these Labrador Retrievers' good behavior. Okay, so conclusion, relatively easy to identify, right? We have a nice conclusion indicator word there. It's the last sentence. Yeah, it's an explanation of the results that we have. All right, and then in our support, which is these two sentences, I would note some keywords that I see. So I see the word every, I see no, and I see if. Oh, if I can actually highlight that. If and not. There. All right. I also see some repetition. So I see repetition of this phrase or qualifier, well-behaved, that like descriptive word. And then I also see good behavior, right? Well-behaved and good behavior are going to be matching up. I see training matching up here. So all of those things, that repetition of ideas, the negation, the word every and the word if, all of those things indicate to me that we are dealing with conditional reasoning. So every indicates a sufficient condition, if indicates a sufficient condition, no, not, right? These things indicate some kind of negation. And then the repetition of those ideas over and over does indicate that we're maybe linking some conditional statements together. So the first statement, our sufficient condition is that it's a Labrador in his neighborhood, right? So I'll just say if L, so that's for Labrador, then well-behaved, okay, which will be WB in this case. So if we have a dog that's not well-behaved, we know it's not a Labrador in this person's neighborhood. The next premise, however, no pet would be well behaved if it were not trained. So if is going to indicate the sufficient condition. So if not trained, okay, sorry. That's yeah, it's someone on in a car in my neighborhood. Just a little loud. I have the window open. Okay. If not trained, then not well behaved, right? So if well behaved, then trained. All right. So what they're suggesting then in the conclusion is that the training accounts for the good behavior, so that they wouldn't have that good behavior if they weren't trained. So here's the support that's offered. The conclusion is if they weren't trained, sorry, if they wouldn't have, sorry, I think I mixed myself up. So it is training, not the genetic makeup of the breed, that accounts for these Labrador Retrievers' good behavior. So their training, they're suggesting that training is not just a necessary condition for good behavior, right? Because if it were a necessary condition, you could have multiple necessary conditions, right? There could be multiple things that you could say, well, if we don't have that, then we're not going to get good behavior. But training isn't necessarily sufficient, right? So nothing in our premises says that training is sufficient. You might also have to have a particular breed in order to get good behavior, right? Training might not be enough just because it's necessary. So what I'm really seeing in the conclusion is that they are suggesting that training is sufficient. Okay, so by saying that training accounts for the good behavior, right, that if they didn't have good behavior, it's because they weren't trained. And if they have the training, then that's going to lead to good behavior. That the genetic makeup actually wouldn't form part of the explanation for them having good behavior. So definitely a tricky one here. So when you get a conclusion where they single out a particular explanation and rule out all other explanations, what they are saying with that is that is sufficient to explain the phenomenon, that we don't potentially need other things going on in order to account for the phenomenon. All right, so what we need is premises that indicate a particular thing is necessary, right? So if we don't have it, that we're going to run into a problem, right? If we don't have it, we can come to a conclusion. And then a conclusion that indicates that that thing is sufficient. So that's where that error lies. All right, and we get a lot of great conditional indicator words here that we can highlight. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just as an exercise for practice. So the word all is going to indicate a sufficient condition. We have if here as well. Oh. And we have some negation. We have all. We have if. Right. The negation here, not and not. So this is actually looking really good so far, right? We're seeing every and all, both sufficient indicator words, sufficient condition indicator words. We have, if here, but it's if not, then, if they don't have good teachers, then the students will not excel, right? So we've got that negation along with the sufficient indicator word. We have in the conclusion, we do have a conditional statement. So we would see potentially a mismatch, right, where they're treating a necessary condition as if it's sufficient by having it in in the conclusion there. So a lot of good indicators in this one. Let's keep going. So whenever, that's going to indicate a sufficient condition. Yet in general, there would not be car crashes unless people were careless. Love this. The word unless we can replace with if not, right? So it's going to indicate that we have a sufficient condition, but we need to negate it. So if people were not careless, there would not be car crashes, is what we would get there. So it is not icy roads, but carelessness that causes car crashes when it snows. So this is great, right? So this is something that we didn't see in A, but that we do see in our original argument, right? That they're eliminating the possibility of genetic makeup. Here, they're eliminating the possibility of icy roads as a cause. So B actually looks better than A, just based on that. We have every musician I know, and then every mathematician I know is a bad dancer. This one right away is looking problematic, right? So if this were similar to the original would probably say something like, every Labrador Retriever in my neighborhood is a well-behaved dog. However, every German Shepherd in my neighborhood is not a well-behaved dog, right? So this thing of these two categories of people that they know, or with the pets that, dogs that they know, and putting them on like a spectrum on either ends of the same spectrum. So in this case, how good they are at dancing, or they a good dancer or a bad dancer, right? So that one I would eliminate because we're just not seeing the connection between the premises that we see in the original. Okay. D, I like the word all there. That's good. But I see this, use butter, not margarine in their cooking. So we wouldn't have an equivalent to that in the first sentence or the second sentence in either of the premises. In the original, we also don't have two premises that they're trying to connect in some way. So we can eliminate D. Okay, and then we have all here, which is going to match with every in terms of indicating a sufficient condition. But they're giving us a concession. So the phrase "even though" indicates a concession. That seems problematic to me. We don't actually have a concession in the original argument. So based on that, I would think this is unlikely to be the correct answer, and I would remove it. To confirm B, I would want to go through the full argument. So whenever it snows, there are relatively more car crashes on the highways. Okay, so if we have snow, then we're going to have more car crashes. Yet in general, there would not be car crashes unless people were careless. So if we were to map this out, we would say, if snow, then car crashes, right? We could do the contrapositive of that. And then yet in general, there would not be car crashes unless people were careless. So if not careless, right, then no car crashes. And so we can see here that's going to match up nicely where we have well-behaved as a necessary condition in the original, and then we see it as a sufficient condition in we see it as a necessary condition in the first premise, and then it's a sufficient condition in the second premise. So here, that's the same thing with car crashes, right? So having car crashes is sufficient to get us to a conclusion, right? They're saying carelessness is a necessary component of car crashes. And then their conclusion is that carelessness here, right, is the cause of car crashes. So if people are careless, then that's enough to cause car crashes. We don't also need icy roads, right? That's not a cause. Just as in the original, they take training here, the necessary condition, to be sufficient. In B, they take carelessness to be sufficient in the conclusion, even though that is not correct. So we do see the same flaw occurring in B. All right, so definitely quite a long explanation for this one, right? This is one of those questions that is likely going to take you significantly more time than some of the other questions. And because it's the last question of the section, a lot of people aren't going to be able to attempt it because they will run out of time, right? So with the time pressure, it's really important to get your pacing down so that you have enough time for these kind of tougher questions at the end in order to really level up your score and get ahead of the curve. Okay. But also keep in mind that this is more of an advanced question, right? This is a more challenging question. So if that's not the level that you're at right now, then, just, even if it is the level that you're at, just go easy on yourself, right? If you're struggling with it. All right, 22 and 23 were also on the list. So 23, we're looking at a flaw. So flaw questions and parallel flaw questions are great to do around, together, because the first steps and probably the most important steps to getting the answer right are going to be the same. So we've got to correctly identify the conclusion, which I'm gonna, I suspect is the last sentence because it starts with hence. And we want to identify the support, which I suspect is the first two sentences. If I have made an error there, I can correct it when I actually read through the paragraph. All right. An official says 6 months ago, the fines for parking violations on the city streets were raised to help pay for the parking garage that had just opened. Okay, so 6 months ago, two things happened. The fines were raised and a parking garage opened. I guess they, built the parking garage and it wasn't paid for yet, and they're raising money to help pay for this garage that is opened. Since that time, okay, so if we're looking at the timeline, we're looking at the 6 months prior to today. Since then, parking violations on our streets have dropped by 50%. Okay, so when we put things on a timeline and we're looking at two events and saying that, oh, this event A preceded event B, often we're going to end up with a correlation causation flaw, right? So we have, because those things are close together in time, right? We see the parking violations drop shortly after the fines are raised. So raising the fines and the violations dropping are happening at the same time. So there's a correlation there between those two factors. And because we're dealing with flawed arguments, if we do see that they've got evidence of a correlation, we kind of want to ask, oh, okay, is the conclusion now assuming a causal relationship between those things? And are they assuming in this case, right, that the fines going up caused the violations to go down, right? So the conclusion is, hence, if we want there to be even fewer parking violations, the fines should be raised again. So this suggests that raising the fines is in fact responsible for the drop in parking violations, and that a further increase in the fines would cause, fewer parking violations again. The core flaw there is correlation causation. Okay. But there are a few different ways that we can describe that flaw of assuming causation from correlation. So when we have the correlation, that means that we have two factors, A and B, that are associated with each other, right? Either A happens and then shortly after B happens, or A and B are both present or heightened in one population versus another population, things like that, right? A population that has characteristic A tends to also have characteristic B. So these things are associated with each other on a timeline or within populations, groups of people. And the causation part is where they are assuming that A causes B. And so we could identify this flaw as they take evidence of a correlation to be proof of causation. Bam, right? That's one way to deal with it. But there are a few other ways to deal with it. So there's the fails to consider option. So that what are they ignoring? So they're failing to consider that B might cause A, and they're failing to consider that C might cause A and B. And there's also potentially the option of a coincidence, or a situation where we can think of, some other cause for the result that we're seeing, the phenomenon that we're seeing, just something other than A causing B, so some other causal connection. Coincidence, chance isn't really a causal connection. It's just, at least that, I think coincidence is more like, yeah, there's a very distant, unknown connection potentially between these causal things, but it goes into the realm of like a philosophical kind of question rather than something that we could be aware of empirically. Okay. So I always want to ask, is it possible that B caused A? Now, in this case, the parking violations dropping can't have caused the fines to be raised because they're on a timeline, right? So if A happened before B, then it's really tough to come up with a way that B caused A, right? So, yes, they're failing to consider that B might cause A, but like, do they really have to consider it? Is it really relevant? Would it, does that seem plausible even? Not really, right? So let's move to them failing to consider that C might cause A and B, or even that C causes B, and A is just it's just a coincidence. So In this case, they're a little bit sneaky, right? Well, a little bit sneaky. I mean, they're always kind of sneaky, aren't they? But they do give us, yeah, I mean, they're either sneaky or they're kind of giving us a hint, right? So we're raised to help pay for a parking garage that had just opened. So the same time that the fines were raised, a parking garage also opened. Could that parking garage be our C variable that could cause B? So the parking garage opening, could that have caused the parking violations to drop significantly? And that seems quite plausible to me. Common sense says that, people are less likely to, park in places that they're not allowed if there's more available parking, right? And the less parking that's available, the more likely people are to, take the risk of parking somewhere that they're not allowed because there just aren't legal parking spaces available, right? So that very well could be the reason for the drop in violations. So that would be something that they're definitely failing to consider. And the fact that it's mentioned and we didn't have to just kind of come up with it on our own means probably that's what we're looking at. So yeah, we can either look at it as takes for granted or assumes that correlation proves causation. We can look at the flaw that way, or we can look at it as what are they failing to consider in terms of the other potential explanations for the information they offer in support of their explanation, right? Could that information also support an alternative explanation? And in this case, I believe it could. All right. So E fails to establish that the initial decrease in parking violations was not due to the availability of additional parking spaces. Yeah, so they fail to establish that C didn't cause B. And so that failure to rule out other potential causal explanations is an issue, right? So here they're not saying that they fail to consider that C might cause B, but rather that they fail to establish that C did not cause B. If we look at the other answer choices, A says takes a possible effect of a reduction to be a possible cause of that reduction. So this would be the scenario where they are assuming that B does not cause A, or assuming that A causes B, not the other way around, right? So that they're switching the cause and effect. Now, in this case, because it's a timeline and the parking violations have dropped since then, since the 6 months ago spot on the timeline, yeah, we do know the temporal relationship between A and B. And so B causing A just is not really a possibility here, common sense wise. B takes for granted or assumes that raising fines a second time will reduce parking violations at least as much as it did the first time. So they actually don't talk about like a 50% reduction or like a similar actual or absolute reduction in parking violations. They just say even fewer parking violations, right? So some decrease rather than a decrease that is at least as great as the original. Even if this one didn't have that, do they assume that raising fines a second time will reduce them as much as the first time? In a sense, yes, but I don't think that goes to like the core of the flaw, which is assuming a causal relationship from a correlation. C, are they failing to take into account the financial benefits the city is now deriving from fines for parking violations? They are not taking that into account, but we don't care because it's irrelevant to the issue at hand, right? The conclusion is about it's conditioned on, do we want even fewer parking violations? We don't need to think about the financial benefits in order to come to a conclusion about, if we want X to happen, then we should take this action. Yeah, it's all conditioned on whether we want that or not, rather than is it worth it for the financial benefits? Are we already getting enough financial benefit? Anything like that is not going to be relevant here. So I can remove that one. D, takes for granted that people who park their cars illegally would prefer to park legally. So they're actually not assuming that. They're not assuming that people would rather park legally. They're kind of assuming that the reason that people don't park illegally anymore is simply because they're being punished for it, rather than because they have a preference for parking legally. Parking, this one, maybe if you thought about, oh, okay, well, the people who were parking illegally before didn't really want to park illegally. They just didn't really have another choice for parking because there weren't any other spots available. And, maybe they just, it was like, okay, well, I have to park somewhere, that sort of thing. So this one, I think, in a convoluted way, you could maybe see a connection to that. But even if you did, it wouldn't be the right orientation. So in this case, they're saying that they're assuming that people who park illegally would prefer to park legally, and that's kind of the opposite of what they're assuming, right? They're assuming that people are just going to change their behavior based on the potential of being punished, rather than if they have the option to park legally, then they would do that. They would prefer to do that, Yeah, and then E, we have fails to establish that the initial decrease in parking violations wasn't due to the availability of additional parking spaces, and that availability has to do with a new parking garage having opened. All right, so again, quite a long explanation for this question, but hopefully there are some nuggets in there that you can take with you to other flawed arguments, and in particular, flawed arguments that use correlation equals causation fallacy. Right, and question 22. This is going to be a fun tongue twister one, because we've got epistemology, epistemologist, epistemological, yeah. So I have a habit of adding an extra syllable in there sometimes. So yeah, we'll see how this goes. All right. So it's an argument, which means we've got a conclusion, we've got support, and the arguments here are flawed, right? So unless we're simply looking for the structure of the argument, we're looking for a flaw in the argument as well. So looking at the support being insufficient to prove the conclusion. And in this case, we actually want to use an answer choice that will weaken the argument. So maybe we can exploit the flaw that exists in this argument. Okay. Historian says, because medieval epistemology, epistemology being the theory of knowledge, is a complex subject, intellectual historians have, until recently, failed to produce a definition that would help to determine what should and what should not be included. All right, so it's complex, failed to define what's in and what's out of this definition. That is until recently. Clearly, so this might be their conclusion, the solution is to define medieval epistemology simply as the epistemological beliefs of the medieval epistemologists. All right, so the solution is what they're suggesting. what are they solving by doing that? What do they claim to be solving? They claim to be solving the issue, the failure to be able to determine what should be in the definition of medieval epistemology and what shouldn't be. All right, so why is this the solution? Because that way, if we want to know whether medieval epistemology includes some epistemological claim, we just ask whether any medieval epistemologist believed it. If any did, it is part of medieval epistemology. If any medieval epistemologist believed the opposite, then that opposite claim is part of medieval epistemology. Okay, so what they're doing here is they're saying, well, we don't have to worry about really defining the claims like by their content. We're just going to define the claims based on who made those claims, right? So were they made by someone that we would label an epistemologist? So we're kind of kicking the can down the road. I think that's I think that's the saying, but sort of like passing the buck. So instead of the issue of is it epistemology or not, we're now going to have to ask the question of is this person an epistemologist or not? And I think it would be fair, pretty fair, pretty safe, pretty along with common sense to say that if we're struggling to define what the content or the definition would be of epistemology, we probably don't have a very clear idea of exactly who is an epistemologist and who is not. It does also seem quite problematic to say that all the claims made by someone with a particular expertise or a particular title relate to that expertise for that title, right? That every claim that they make, relates to their, I guess like professional expertise. I don't know anyone that would be true of. I think people make a lot of claims outside the scope of their expertise on a regular basis. Also, people can have more than one realm of expertise. So that would be an additional criticism of this argument. Okay, let's get into the answer choices. We're looking to weaken here. So we're looking to really disconnect their support from their conclusion and make it less likely that the solution that they've offered is really a viable solution. A, medieval epistemologists held some of the same epistemological beliefs as did ancient epistemologists or epistemologists. This one, we really don't care about a comparison to ancient epistemologists. That doesn't form any part of the definition. And even if they had overlapping beliefs, would that really be a problem, right? So like maybe a belief could be included in the subject of medieval epistemology and also ancient epistemology. We don't have any reason to think that medieval epistemology is would like have to exclude ideas that are also present in epistemology of like an earlier time period. B, the epistemological beliefs of medieval epistemologists. I'm doing it again. I keep saying epistemologist. I'm not exactly sure where that extra syllable comes from, what other, there's probably some other word where that exists. And anyways, sorry, sidetrack. Okay. The epistemological beliefs of medieval epistemologists depended upon their beliefs about non-epistemological matters. So this one, like a dependence relationship, this one is definitely interesting. I can certainly understand being tempted by this one, but it doesn't really hit upon the issue that I mentioned about it's problematic to take all the claims of a particular expert and think that all has to do with the realm of their expertise. But just because someone's expertise depends on something outside of their expertise isn't quite the same thing, right? So that relationship is going backwards rather than saying, well, there are some things that this person is going to claim that are not going to be within the realm of their that one area of expertise that they have, or that one like philosophy that they're kind of defined by, right? That they might speak on other matters. That's not what they're saying here. They're saying when they speak on matters of epistemology, the content of that is connected, dependent on things that would not be included in that content. So going backwards there, that's not really a concern. C, the writings of most medieval epistemologists include passages that are clearly not about epistemology. So, okay. So this actually isn't going to be a problem because we're worried about stuff that could be in the definition. If it's clearly not, then that won't pose a problem, right? If we can easily, clearly eliminate it, then that's we're not trying to use the solution to deal with this issue. Essentially with this one, they're talking about something that's a non-issue because it's not going to cause problems for drawing boundaries around what is and what isn't in that in the theory of knowledge category. Also a tough one though. D, some medieval epistemologists had epistemological beliefs that contradicted the epistemological beliefs of other medieval epistemologists. We don't care about that contradiction, right? And in fact, they kind of talk about contradiction already, right? They say both the claim and the opposite claim, so if there's debate among medieval epistemologists, all of their claims would be included in the realm or the definition of epistemology. So even if they're contradictory beliefs, it would be both of those beliefs would form part of the study of knowledge or the theory of knowledge. So you can still have debate within that subject, and the argument kind of concedes that that's going to happen. So the fact that it would happen sometimes wouldn't weaken the argument. it's included within the argument. So E has to be the correct answer. So what does it say? There is much debate. So if there's much debate about something, that means it's not a settled issue. It's not clear who's right and who's wrong, right? There's still there's still more than one opinion to be had on it. So it hasn't been clearly defined. So there's much debate as to which medieval thinkers, if any, were epistemologists. So if that's the case, then we don't have a clear definition of who is and who is not an epistemologist. So to simply ask whether any medieval epistemologist believed it is simply going to pass the buck or kick the can down the road, and it's not actually going to solve the problem of defining what should and should not be included in the definition of epistemology. Well, that's E. All right, so yeah, hopefully that helps. If you have like further questions, if you're going, okay, well, I chose particular answer for one of these, and I still don't understand why that answer is wrong. I still don't understand why the correct answer is correct. Feel free to let me know. Yeah, these are definitely tough questions. So yeah, well done. If you're getting to this stage where the rest of them, you're like, okay, I can understand that. And these are sort of the remaining questions in this section that are giving you trouble. Then yeah, these are tough ones. So yeah, hopefully my explanations helped somewhat. Right. Hope you have a good one. Good day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And feel free to leave questions in the comments.